Boa tarde. Vamos ver agora a última longa-metragem que o Jean-Luc Godard fez, Adeus, Linguagem. Temos aqui para nos apresentar o filme o escritor britânico Adam Thirlwell e também Arto, Lindsay, que já esteve aqui connosco. Adam.
Thank you, Antonio. Costa.
I think we don't want to hold you up when we want to watch the movie, but I think one of the things I'm interested in, I suppose, especially as I'm a writer and we have Langage in the title, is to talk about Godard's relationship with language. And it's funny, just having come out of Vivre sa vie, and where you realize that there's such a strange dislocation in his work, I think, between, you could say the soundtrack and the image, but also within the soundtrack, the use of language and the image, that you think of him as such a kind of sculptor, like a visual sculptor, and that's obviously true, but it's almost like he uses kind of collage techniques in relation to the language as well.
As well as a distancing technique. I mean, in Vivre sa vie, Anna Karina plays a prostitute and she sits down and has a conversation with a philosopher, and they talk about loving and distrusting language, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting, like we were just saying, like what is the actual function? Is it? And clearly there's no one function, one scene in a Godard movie, but I think what is interesting, I guess, is how much in that scene you're basically meant to follow her questioning of the relationship between truth and language, and whether there's a closer relationship between truth and silence, I suppose, right. Which is then linked to how often silence is used. You know, you were saying in the soundtrack that he loves this, one of the most Godardian, like the way you'd know you'd walked into a Godard movie would be if just momentarily the sound cuts out. And that kind of investigation of the sign, of the layers of the cinematic sign, I think is something that really Godard invented and hasn't really been followed either. That's one of the things I think I find so strange about Godard. Like he often, I think, uses Joyce as, whenever he wants a literary reference in interviews, he'll often kind of compare what he does to what Joyce did in Ulysses. And I think one way in which they are similar is also in the way that their experiments haven't really been reinvestigated. I often feel like Godard does all this stuff, like there's such generosity of experiment, and then the art of cinema kind of carries on as if Godard never happened. And that's obviously a exaggeration, but that way of questioning seems to me something...
It's true, in cinema especially. I think Godard was an inspiration to a lot of artists who make movies, and they're able to follow him more than movie makers are.
Yeah.
You know?
And I guess it comes back to partly this issue of his freedom from narrative constraint, his freedom from, it seems to me, the kind of Hollywood structure. Like I'm always amazed whenever I talk to kind of LA screenwriters how unable they are not to see the world in terms of acts and, you know, beats, right. and it's kind of terrifying.
Conflict and resolution and another conflict and final resolution. And
you think it's a joke, and then you realize there is no other way for the conventional film to kind of see itself. And Godard is just so distant from that. And I think that certainly in Adieu Langage, you know, again, there is a kind of story kind of that is gestured towards.
Right.
There are various relationships and kind of, but you would be insane to be watching kind of for the story.
No. Right. I think there's even less. There's not much of a story in Adieu Langage. There's a couple, you know, and there's some really creative uses of 3D, in a way that nobody else uses it, you know. And there are some moments where he kind of captures a kind of beauty you can only capture in 3D. I don't want to tell you which moment I think is really beautiful, but back to language, I think just to talk about his use of intertitles, you know, in Godard's film, the film will go along and then it will stop and there'll be a written quote, and sometimes there's a voiceover and sometimes not, you know. But I find that use musical, you know, or, you know, it's like it's not language, it's not used the way language normally is. It's not expository. It doesn't tell you more of the story, doesn't describe the scene, doesn't comment on the story. It's like a kind of climax within the
Yeah, because it's strange, because I suppose if you think that the intertitle starts from silent movies as dialogue, it starts as, and then one of the things I think that's always very ambiguous about it is it's never all the dialogue. You know, you can, one of the things I always find quite amusing is, and you can actually see it in, say, Joan of Arc there, that far more is being said in a silent movie silently than is then given to you in the, it's like a subtitle actually. It's like kind of when you get titles and they're clearly a reduced version of whatever has just been said on the screen. And then he takes that, which is really just a, like in silent, he takes something that's just a sort of opportunistic, practical issue, which clearly would never have been invented if sound were there at the start, and then uses the fact that writing can be interpolated into cinema in such a kind of crazy creative way. I think this idea, so that you get almost like the idea of the script actually becomes much more meaningful in Godard if you think about how kind of written it feels. At the same time as he's one of the great filmmakers for clearly never shooting from a kind of ordinary script, but the finished product to me is so kind of, like you were saying, Gabe, like the idea of cartoon, and I think there is that kind of a written visual object that we don't really have analogues for.
Well, I guess he loves to read, or a little bit at a time, but he makes us read, while we're watching the movie. He makes us stop and read, because when you read, reading is different than watching. It's a different way of understanding things.
Yeah. Although clearly also has such a strong distrust. I think what's so fascinating about him is he has a huge distrust of language, which I think is very present in this movie that we're about to watch, and a distrust of the image, that he is so, in different ways, or like in Histoire du Cinéma, I think is his great investigation of what an image is and how much it can conceal or distort. And I think that's what maybe gives him his energy in cinema, is he kind of distrusts the entire medium, like he distrusts all of it. And yet then that pushes him. So I think the fact that he's probably one of the first people to really investigate what 3D can do, that seems to me something quite moving about like an 80-year-old guy being the person at the forefront of a medium.
Yeah. Well, he does crazy stuff, as you'll see, with 3D that most people don't do. I mean, he doesn't try to make something that's more lifelike. He tries to make something you've never seen before.
Yeah.
Doesn't always succeed, but, it's pretty amazing to watch.
Yeah, I think he takes it into a kind of, I feel like there's a dimension in which more ordinary filmmakers use it just, as a kind of almost, and it feels in fact incredibly old-fashioned, because it feels like those really old-fashioned stereoscope kind of pictures where the background actually is so detached from the foreground that it's clearly a fake. And it's as if he, though, takes that and enjoys it, and I think actually does amazing things with landscape. And sort of there are certainly images I remember of first seeing it, where it kind of makes you feel like you're seeing a tree or something for the first time. And that use of depth, I think, is definitely something where it doesn't just feel like a gimmick or some showmanship. He seems to me so far from spectacle. And yet 3D feels, I don't know, when Baz Luhrmann loses it in Gatsby or something, just pure showmanship. And I guess that kind of comes back to the beginning of there is a sincerity in the use of the medium in Godard, which is quite ruthless almost, which is quite
yeah, and he's also very sad, and he's been sad since the beginning. You know what I mean?
He's been saying goodbye since, that's the other thing I think, there in the title is idea, but he's like, we were talking yesterday about Le Mépris and how already that's a farewell to cinema long before Weekend with its actual fin du cinéma, which he's been elegiac from basically the beginning. And I think there's something kind of wonderful. That seems to make him such an modernist, I think. I feel like the great modernist artists are all fundamentally kind of of the opinion that the medium is over before they've started, that it's kind of, and there's something interesting always, I think, with cinema when that is so telescoped, and Godard, I think, is always very interesting about this, that this is such a young, compared to every other art form, it's the youngest medium. And so to already have its epochs,
Right.
you know, it doesn't make sense almost for something to have its epochs when only 100 years of it exists. So it's true, he's also very great at titles. Like, I think one of the interesting things is his titles are always so perfect for each movie.
Right.
And kind of perfect in relation to each other. I'm sure you could just analyze the titles.
And when he's, I like his dialogue too. I don't know if he writes, how much of it he writes and how much of it he improvises with the actors, but it's pretty wonderful. We don't.
Are there any questions? I don't know if you'd have questions before.
We usually do this. No, actually, we do it before, don't we?
Well.
Any questions? Enjoy the movie.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.